Well, good afternoon, good afternoon, good afternoon, and good afternoon. George, good afternoon to you.
G'day.
Doing well?
Yeah. No,
Man,
all good.
man, a few words. Yep. G'day, mate. Yep.
You know.
Yeah. How are you, man? How's things going? How's life? How's the world of George, of Jorge?
Well, okay, so I had this weird interaction yesterday. We were in a classroom, a new classroom, and it's a computer lab. I'll try to be fast with this. And, it's a computer lab that's not always booked by a classroom, so there's people in there using it in their own time. And there was this guy in the corner at the back, and I had not many students, so I was like, oh, fuck it, I'll just leave it. I'll just leave him up the back there. He's got headphones on. He's not doing anything. But then, while I'm presenting to the class, he gets up and sort of loudly leaves the room to go to the toilet, comes back, the door's open. He comes back in, and I look at him and I'm like, okay, dude, we've got a classroom in here. It's time for you to go. And he's like, nah, I'll just be up the back. And I was like, nah, it's sort of disruptive. And he's like, no, I'm not disrupting anyone. I was like, well, you've just sort of exemplified that you are. And he's like, no, I'll just be there. And I was like, dude, are you serious? And it started getting real tense. My students were like, oh shit. This guy wanted to fucking fight me because I was telling him to get out of the classroom. And then he was I sort of just kept going with it until, it was just going to be awkward if he stayed there.
Yeah.
And he left. But so that's my story of the last 24 hours. nearly getting in a scrap with a student over office space, as it were.
It's funny, when people get aggressive with you. I had an interaction with a dog owner up at a park there not too long ago, and I just said to them they didn't have their dog under control, sprinted 200 meters to come and interact with our dog. And look, not a big deal, but I just kind of went, dude, I was quite gentle. If you're owners who come here need to have real good control of their dogs, because it's not a dog park, it's just a park, and if there was a kid here who was scared of dogs, so if you wanted to run your dog free and they're still too young to be trained, there's a dog park a kilometer away. Got really angry with me, and ended up, I was 15 meters away from him, and he goes, dude, get up in my fucking face. And I'm like, dude, I'm literally 15 meters away. It's I can't be in your face from 15 meters away. But it was, people get aggressive. Anywho, my last 24 hours have been interesting. And, I've been rallying for quite a long time about how the government, in my opinion, has let us down around this area of COVID, because they have released the Kraken a little bit too early. And I will tell you why that's relevant to me shortly. But I noticed the newsroom has a really interesting article. Leaked email from a data analyst at the Ministry of Education has gone rogue, calling for reinstatement of school mask mandates. And an email the government disavows. I don't know whether that means they think it doesn't exist, or they're just saying, I don't acknowledge this email. The government is accused of being asleep at the wheel when it comes to protecting children from COVID-19 in this internal email obtained by Newsroom. Interesting that the email was signed by the ministry's chief, signed as in, I agree with this, not it was from her, from the chief executive, Iona Holstead, and dozens of other ministry employees, and says the government has a responsibility to prevent as many children as possible from being infected with COVID. Here's the most telling comment from it. We still have a responsibility to, so this is from this analyst to Chris Hipkins. We still have a responsibility to prevent as many children as possible from being infected and reinfected with SARS-2. It's a dangerous disease whose long-term effects are as yet unknown, and many of our tamariki remain unvaccinated. Without masks, they stand a very they stand very little protection at all. And George, and anyone who's watched this has known for a long time, I've been rallying against this. The two schools that my two children who are still at school are at have both said we're not going to enforce mask mandates. And I've been saying time and time again, here in Southern, we are 3 times the numbers we should be for being in that kind of safe zone. So there's no way that there should be an orange zone down here. Of course, what happens today? Well, my 12-year-old's at home with a scratchy throat. And I'm like, my 12-year-old and my 15-year-old, they are responsible kids. They do the right thing with masks. But the principal of one of the schools has basically said, we're going to follow ministry guidelines. But as you can see from things like this email, there are a lot of people saying the ministry or the government is not following what epidemiologists are suggesting. And I found out yesterday for the first time that my 12-year-old is masking up correctly. She's still masked at school, and she's like, only when we eat. And I'm like, yeah, that's fine. When you eat outside. She goes, oh, no, we're eating inside. And I'm like, what? And she says, yeah, we eat inside. And I'm like, so what the school's actually doing now is making it more likely that the kids are going to get infected with COVID, because the ones that want to mask are now being forced, my word, to take their masks off to have their lunch inside around the other kids. So, of course, what happened is one of the kids at my 12-year-old's table was sick. I don't think sick at school, but the next day was sick. So could well have had it, could well have passed it on. So I've got a 12-year-old with a scratchy throat today, and I'm going, anyone who's watched any of these interactions we've done knows how I've rallied against this stuff. And I've been like, we want to be careful and we're trying to protect it. And I feel like this, right? My kids, myself, people who live in my house have all done what we need to do to be as safe as we can. There's no guarantees, but as safe as we can. And it seems now that my two children, who are very responsible, know the situation, know the potential pitfalls from this. Even they've done what they're supposed to do, and the systems around them have let them down. So the principal has gone, I'm not a health expert. I'm going to defer to the Ministry of Health. And in doing that, what they've actually done to the 12-year-olds is say, now you need to be the health expert. So they need to have these 12-year-olds make these decisions for them and their families. And if you speak to any epidemiologist, they will all disagree that this is the situation that it should be in schools right now. In fact, I'm hearing and I'm understanding that there are schools in Auckland, one of the better areas of New Zealand for COVID, who are going back to enforcing masks. So I'm a little bit frustrated. I'm a little bit furious, to be honest, about the whole thing, because I don't have any grudges with people getting COVID or whatever. But when we take undue risks, or when you have a group that it feels like to me, and this is the schools, who are palming off responsibility onto children, I think that's irresponsible. And if COVID came into anyone's house, forget that it's a me thing, anyone's house, and then that COVID impacted those people, and the reason it came in there was irresponsible decisions made by a school, does the school have some responsibility? I mean, is there blame to be placed here? I don't know. So I'm a bit frustrated with the whole thing, but we're not going to talk too much about that today, other than my little rant, because I'm going to do some more numbers today, and we might try and get into that tomorrow on a broader situation. Who knows? Maybe the government will reinstate mask mandates in schools by the end of today, but we'll talk about that more tomorrow. What we are going to talk about today, later on today, this afternoon, we've got a Professor of Taxation coming in. She is going to be talking to us. Lisa Marriot is her name. She wrote a very interesting piece the other day about wealth tax. And she said, even if next week's budget avoids the issue, it's time New Zealand seriously considered a wealth tax. So we're going to be having a chat about that in the second half of this hour. Interesting, fascinating conversation. I've already had it with her. I could only grab her for about 20 minutes yesterday afternoon. So when you see the wardrobe change, don't be put off. It's because it's coming from a conversation I had with Lisa yesterday. Second part of the show. The first part of the show, though, we are going to be talking about Gloriavale on a couple of different levels. Actually, Gloriavale is back in the news today because of a situation where I'll paraphrase it, and then we're going to play some audio visual for you, but they're being forced to acknowledge that let's say 6-year-olds working full-time is not a good thing. That's the first thing. But also that, and I've seen this in other religious organizations, is that if someone is working a permanent and full-time job, you can't call them a volunteer. It's a little bit like if you have, and I know this because I've investigated interns, if you have an intern, they're not allowed to replace someone else. You're not allowed to use an intern as a full-time worker. You're not allowed to use volunteers as a full-time worker. You have to have them as full-time workers. This has come to the forefront of our news again today because of recent decisions coming out of the court. And I believe, George, you can take over from here because you've got a little bit of audio visual to play us.
Yeah, so people will remember that there's two chaps and a team of Labour, employment lawyers took this case to the employment court and basically said, look, we've been working since we were 6 years old, and not getting paid, etc., and we're forced to. There were people under 18 working, and basically the state had failed them. There'd been the employment or Labour inspectorate go out there in 2017, for example, and find they were volunteers, which is a strange way of looking at it after this court decision, which will open the door, as we see here from another article, for other people, not just those two blokes there who have left the community, to get some compensation. Nonetheless, here's some audio from one of the head lawyers on this.
They have got massive industries there, all built on child labour and on free labour with the adults, and that is wrong.
Brian Henry led the legal challenge and says the ramifications are huge.
So their child labour is now going to cost them money, but also they have to give them proper breaks. They have to work correct hours.
This ruling and the impact of it is going to reverberate through Gloriavale for a long time.
In 2020, when...
And that was one of the other lawyers as well. And Gloriavale's lawyers said basically, in return, they're able to be a part of this community, etc., etc. But it's hard to classify it as volunteer when you're born into it, and also, the sort of limitations when it comes to trying to leave, but also not work, obviously related here as well. Here's some sort of, I guess, the blowback now from that court ruling means a whole lot of other things can happen.
Gloriavale is a registered charity enjoying tax exemptions and other benefits. Charities Services says we have opened an investigation into this registered charity. In making its decision, it said it noted the Chief Employment Court judge raised concerns across a range of matters. And should a charity be found to have engaged in serious wrongdoing, they may be deregistered.
And here's what the minister...
WorkSafe will be visiting very soon. WorkSafe have a broad ability to ensure that any work that is being carried out is done in a way that is safe and appropriate.
And the Labour Inspectorate, criticised in the court judgment, says it too will take action and visit Gloriavale.
Labour Inspectorate has always taken the Gloriavale issue seriously.
Stu Lumsden...
Yeah, and also, mentioned there, criticised for the inaction 2017. So it seems like, this is sort of helping, to make up for some of those failings from the Labour Inspectorate and a whole bunch of other things that have happened over the years, not to mention what I haven't even talked about here, which is the stuff to do with sexual assault and all that kind of stuff as well, which I'm sure maybe our guests can get into as well. But there's some context and why this has sort of been in the news over the past few weeks.
Yeah, and it seems that perhaps within this religious organization and others that I know about, one of the things that they try that is a defense is that, well, this is family. And like if you own a dairy and your 6-year-old doesn't work for you in that dairy because you're the owner of the dairy and they're your child, that's different from what we're talking about here. They say we're family, but you may not be family. And it comes back to that idea, I think, of if you're being used as a full-time employee, then you are a full-time employee, not a volunteer. And so it'll be interesting. I don't know too much of the inner workings of Gloriavale. They've always fascinated me. And I wonder how much dollars, how much value they have, how much wealth they have, because if there's going to be, 10, 100, 1,000 people now going, actually, that 18 years of full-time work I did, I want compensation for it, whether they're able to do that or not. So that's why the story's in the news around Gloriavale. Now, we're going to take a slight tack away from that, although our guest coming up, Olivia Wensley, is a former lawyer, so we may have some a way to look at the legalities of all this as well. But Olivia, well, let's just bring Liv in and have a chat with her. Welcome to the show, Olivia.
Hi, thanks for having me again.
Yeah, no, I'm fascinated at the conversation we're about to have. But before we get into the part that people don't know about so much, as a former lawyer, and I guess as someone who works with startup businesses and involved around employment law, what do you think about the ruling yesterday? And do you have anything you want to comment on that part of it first?
Oh, just seeing that ruling coming through, it's about time. I'm so glad that finally there's been recognition of what's actually going on in Gloriavale. It's a very complicated, many layers to the situation there, and finally someone has set precedent that means that real action is going to be taken now to lift the hood and see what's truly going on.
And that's lift the hood on the money side of things. I think the hood's been lifted before on the George mentioned sexual crimes and that kind of thing side of things. But I don't know. Like I was just talking to someone before we came on, and the Arise situation moved up, the Arise Church situation. And it seems that when money is involved, that drives a lot of the other things as well, because with money comes an amount of power. And it's interesting, I don't know the situation with Gloriavale, but it's interesting the observation that so many of these religious organizations that are run by men, when money gets involved with that, it goes down a certain dark path. Whereas when these religious organizations are run by women, it's a different situation often. Like if you line up 100 of the worst offenders in the world from religious organizations, probably 99 of them would be men. I mean, I know they're mostly run by men, but it's disproportionate. Which is, I mean, like you're known as the catalyst of the Me Too movement. So you want to share your thoughts on that side of it at all?
Yeah, well, and what's also interesting is it's always, they say it's God's will. Is always God's will always directly aligns with what these leaders want as well, and it's often, you're right, it's often very much tied to money, power, but then God's behind them, and they use that as an excuse. Yeah, it's very, very interesting.
It's weird though how you don't often hear about women. I mean, women within a religious organization or women leaders, or within they can, there's paths that they can use and abuse, and often it involves luxury and money and expensive car stuff. But when men get that, it involves abuse, sexual offending. There's a different vibe about it, and it's uglier, really is.
Yeah, it all comes down to power and abuse of that. And that's what's going on there at the moment.
Well, listen, you and I had a 2-minute chat this morning, and you blew my brain with what you've been up to in that 2-minute chat. I put a tweet out this morning, and I'll read it. And I am saying Olivia Wensley joins us live at midday. No, it's 1:15 midday, to tell her story of helping a 22-year-old woman and her mother escape Gloriavale after coming and going to the West Coast community for 6 years undercover. That's the headline of your story. The floor is yours. I want to hear everything.
Oh, it's I mean, everything would take hours and hours. I'll try and give you a succinct summary of what's happened. I also have to be very careful because it's obviously really sensitive. I want to be respectful to the woman that I helped, and but it's a story that's very interesting. So it began so 6 years ago, my husband and I, this was around about the time that the documentaries were on TV. And I was fascinated by this cult. I've read a lot about cults. I've read about everything in America. It's just sort of real interesting thing, the psychology behind it. So I thought it'd be interesting to be able to go and observe and sort of see what was happening. So we managed to go. We went to one of the concerts there, and it was just, oh my gosh. I just like I said, I could talk for hours and hours and hours about what I saw and what it was like. But it was just very, it's unlike anything that you could imagine is happening in provincial New Zealand. It's like a miniature dictatorship, like a miniature North Korea, because they've got, they're so isolated and such they are so unaware of what's happening in the outside world. There's no cell phones, there's no technology, there's very few access to, they call it worldly things. So they're very, very isolated. And but it's I just don't even do you want to ask some questions, because I don't even know where to even start with.
So you kind of sort of, without being disrespectful to them, you kind of went there on a bit of a goof. You're like, what is this crazy place all about?
It was interesting. It was out of genuine interest to go along and have a look, and it was something that just very, very interested to see. So we felt really lucky that we were invited there, and we were always respectful as guests, and they took us in as guests. We stayed there. We stayed overnight.
How did you manage that? Would anyone be welcome to stay there? Did you have to pull a few fasties to try and convince them that you were safe people? What was the story?
Yeah, I better not go into that. But we managed to get in. Yeah, that's because it was there was a bit of maneuvering to be able to get the okay to go in.
And this was just because that was at a stage. We're going to go into the story about how you help someone get out, or a couple of people get out, but this is not even at that stage. You had to make some maneuverings, as you say, just to even get in the door, purely because you were interested to see what it was all about.
That's right. That's right. Because, I mean, naturally, they're very cautious and guarded about who comes in. And it's also very carefully managed. So the concerts that they hold are very, very carefully stage managed, so that it's, like I said, like the analogy is like North Korea. It's you get very carefully guided through and shown, this is wonderful. This is a great life that we have here.
Yeah.
And so, but it's pretty easy to see what's actually going on. So it's like stepping into another world. People wouldn't look me in the eye because I was a woman. I'd ask a question and they'd look at my husband and speak to him.
Wow.
Instead. And it was surreal. So I've been back a few times. So the first time that we went, we met this young woman, and I just got the sense that something, and this is before it was sort of really in the media with what was going on, I just sort of got this very uneasy feeling of what you can tell that the wool's being pulled over your eyes when you're there, and what's actually happening. So
ironically, you can probably tell that because you're worldly, which is the thing that's supposed to be avoided, but because you know what's going on, and we have these things called bullshit nerves in the back of our neck, and if something doesn't feel right or look right or smell right, often it's not right. So your interactions with the people were somewhat staged, is what I hear you saying.
Very staged, very managed. Yes.
Probably that they were supposed to answer in a certain way, and they were supposed to be there. You met this young woman, and obviously there are details you're not going to share, but you said you visited several times. Did the reason you went back again and again, was it because of her, or like the second time you're still kind of, let's go look again, it was interesting? How did that relationship grow to eventually, 6 years later, you're helping this woman and her mother escape?
So it was sort of, so I went, and I just can't sort of help myself when I know something's not right, that it was like, okay, what can we do? I mean, the first time we visited, it was out of curiosity, but then I sort of got into the situation where it's like, okay, I just can't sit back and let this happen, because it was very clear that there was very, very bad things happening there. So we went back a couple of years after our first visit and reconnected with this woman, and again, just alarm bells going off. It was all this, it's wonderful here, and it's very clearly not. So there was.
Can you expand on that a little bit? I mean, when you say it's very clear that it's something like, if I'm looking at a wall that's painted red, it's very clear that wall is red. It's obvious to me. Can you expand a bit on how and why you knew it was very clear?
Yeah, good question. So it was the mannerisms of everyone around. Everyone was afraid, and so everyone, being the people at Gloriavale, there's a huge amount of fear. No eye contact, very sort of withdrawn and unhappy. The people sort of, it was this weird sort of, it was like this parade being shown in front of you. The concert was incredible, absolutely amazing.
Wow.
But it was all smokes and mirrors, and it's pretty, it was interesting. So what happened is I saw the young woman again, and we became pen pals, and just over years of just talking to her, building friendship and trust, so that with the view that if she ever needed help to leave and get out, that I was there for her. So
did that communication with you, the pen pals, was that like unfettered? Or do you think that there was an intermediary? Like, would you send a letter that would get read and then passed on and vice versa? Or do you think that was free and open?
All communications were done with the presumption that someone else was reading or listening, because it's very, very vulnerable. So a very fragile sort of situation, because she's so vulnerable that I couldn't do anything. That it had to be handled very, very delicately. I couldn't say anything. All I did was maintain friendship and built trust so that she felt safe if the worst would happen and she needed to get out. So because of that, because it was so difficult to communicate, I actually went there again when I had my baby, who was 8 months old, and I drove there myself, just me and my baby, because that's non-threatening, right? So I went and just to do a welfare check and check that, and give the offer of help. And it had to be in person because it couldn't be written, it couldn't be over the phone. And at the time, again, I was told, no, everything is great here. And I could just see behind the eyes, but it's very, every time I visited, I'd leave and I'd feel very upset and feeling so helpless, a feeling of helplessness, because it's not just, there's hundreds of women and children in there who are at danger, who are being harmed. A policewoman that I've been speaking to about the situation, she's actively involved in the community. She calls it New Zealand's biggest crime scene. And it is. Yeah. So the statistics of sort of what's actually going on there in terms of abuse with women and children, it's just mind blowing. And so that's why I'm so glad to see this ruling, because it's actually affirmative action that's going to do something, instead of, the Labour inspector going in and saying, no, nothing to see here, because it's obviously everything's scripted. And I mean, if I could go in the first time and say, hold on, this isn't right. There's one thing that people may be saying, and they're coached to say that, but the reality is a totally other thing. So these people, they all have to sign a contract by the time they turn 18. They have no idea what a contract is. They have no idea. That says that it's witnessed by an independent lawyer. I've seen a copy of the contract, and they think that they're signing their lives away, and that they'll be damned to hell for all eternity if they break the contract. And so it's just, it's hopeless. And so that's why government intervention is very, very important.
Makes me think of the Scientology stories where you hear them signing million-year contracts from what they're going on,
right.
and then they get told if you break it, it's whatever the result for Scientology is. You've mentioned words like unhappy and scared. You said that they were unhappy and they were scared, but you're also saying that they're all kind of going, oh, everything's fine. Is that your interpretation of what you saw, or was someone kind of, I can't say too much, but it's pretty bad here. So what you saw with them being unhappy and scared, that's your interpretation, or do some of them actually say it to you?
No, what happened is I connected with leavers, and I managed. What happened is I met this woman who was a teenager when I first met her. She was 16, and because I had this feeling, this spidey sense, hold on, this is not right. I managed to find that she had a sister who had escaped when she was 18. So then I was able to contact the sister and speak to her about the family dynamics. And lo and behold, it's an absolute nightmare of a story. Just so much abuse, so much horrible, horrible things, so much suffering. And so speaking to her, it made me sure that, right. It gave me sort of tools to be able to help.
Right.
And sort of pull together others that were able to help as well. There's a huge network of people that are behind the scenes, keeping undercover, and to try and sort of pull this thing apart, because it needs to be, it needs to come down. It's modern slavery in New Zealand.
Wow. I'm interested as to the events surrounding you getting the two people out. I much like you am someone, this is what I believe you've said, who is really interested in the idea of cults and that sort of thing. I've studied a lot of them all through my era, and I'm quite fascinated at the Scientology story and what Leah Remedy's been doing, that kind of thing. And hearing the
Yes.
stories of how some of the ex-Scientologists have had to get literally out of a complex, like hiding in boots and all that kind of stuff. I'm interested to hear what you can share. Don't know what there is about the actual events of these two people. You know, at midday they're in the complex, and at 1 p.m. they're, whatever the time difference is, they're on the road away from the complex. Can you tell us that story and how that actually happened?
It's really, again, I don't I don't want to be difficult, but it's sort of what happened is it's very, very sensitive. But what happened is the how can I say this? The woman who needed to get out needed somewhere safe that they could trust to go to. So what happened is they were able to leave. They were able to, there was an event that happened that they were able to use as a reason to get out temporarily, and I was able to get them. If that makes, so sorry I don't mean to be too opaque, but it's sort of, I was able to take them into our home. We were able to get them emergency accommodation. We were able to, oh my gosh, integrating them into society was very, very interesting. It's what an experience. I mean, it's because the situation is like almost refugees, but in their own country, if that makes sense. Culturally, huge culture shock. Even just going shopping is very, very overwhelming and scary. Even things like crossing the road, that comes so naturally to us. You know, it's sort of that kind of, they have to really think and focus to sort of be able to it's a huge cultural shock when people leave. And I'm just so amazed at how brave they are. Oh my gosh, it's just so resilient, especially so the girl's sister who I got to know really well, where she's come from after being out for a few years. She's studied, she's graduated, she's living her best life. She was here in Queenstown doing bungee jumps and sort of really like living life to the fullest. So that was incredible to see the transformation, and the woman that her sister who we helped when she came out and got her integrated to society as well, she's really flourishing. Like, it's just amazing to see how well she's doing. And she's got a massive journey ahead of her. It doesn't make sense what's happened to her, and coming out and realizing she's been lied to her whole life. And it's it's mind-blowing. But there's really great work being done there's a Gloriavale Leavers Trust in Timaru, and they do huge work. Yeah, it's I mean, what we did is just nothing in comparison to the huge work gone on by so many volunteers and people housing whole families that just escape and show up on their front doorstep. So
I think I was watching News Hub last night. It was one of the channels. I might have been watching it on YouTube, and there was a report about what was going on, and they said whilst Gloriavale hasn't responded to the accusations, one of the claims that was made is that the site was locked down and all of the members had their cell phones and stuff taken off them. The one release that came out of Gloriavale was the reporter had spoken to the person in charge, and the person in charge had said no cell phones have been taken off. That's not true. What is your vibe to that?
No cell phones were taken off because they're not allowed cell phones.
Right. So that's probably meaning the leaders still all have their cell phones, but none of the 20-year-olds have had their cell phones taken away because they don't have cell phones.
No, they're not allowed. So there's not even any cell phone coverage. There is Wi-Fi there. So some of the select few are allowed to access Wi-Fi. But this is what the problem is. It's very dangerous. And this is what I've been saying needs to happen, is if they want to make sure that everyone there is okay, they need to give them access to tools to say, I need help. Because when you hear some of the escape stories, it's just unbelievable. They're so remote they're so remote. It's like a dirt road to get there, no cell phone reception. It's just literally in the middle of nowhere. So you have people sort of escaping by walking down the river or just walking down the road, not even knowing where they're going or what's going to happen.
So
And
you're 20 something year old and mother that you helped get out. Had they ever been to a city before? Had they ever been
yes,
to the main road?
So they're allowed to go to Greymouth occasionally for very, very occasionally, and it's strictly monitored. So they don't have freedom. They've got no concept of what money is or anything like that. So that was very interesting. It was hard actually getting when you have people coming out of that when they've got no bank account or they've got no concept of money or no concept of just helping them, sort of teaching them all about these things that we learn as kids. I helped them get their driver's license, which was really neat. So we got them doing the road code and doing that. And that was a huge step. So this kind of thing, it was really, really rewarding and hard, but really rewarding to be integrating them into society and showing them
their points about them being
life.
in their own country. Like I've experienced like working in the Pacific Islands and then coming home and being incredibly grateful for the resources I had at home. Or going from Auckland, for example, where I grew up as a kid, the supermarkets, and ending up in Los Angeles and being like, oh my goodness, they've got two aisles of cereal and nothing else. Or I'm also reminded of people who come out of prison who kind of can't function because they're not used to being able to walk out the front door. And it reminds me of all of those, but it feels then 10 times more serious and 10 times heightened because they're actually people, it's not that they've done nothing, yet they have all these same non-experiences to then experience as adults. It must be wild.
It is. And it's sort of like the refugee analogy is definitely right, but it's almost one step further because at least refugees in their home country, they're taught about what money is. They have this sort of exposure to an outside world of some kind. So it's like coming from another planet for them. That's why I'm just so amazed and in awe of the resilience and adaptability of these people that have made this leap from, I mean, it's a hell on earth in there. But they figure that there's nothing that they're taught that they will literally go to hell forever if they go outside, and yet it's still worth it to them.
Wow.
And that shows how bad it is in there.
New Zealand's biggest crime scene. Was that the quote?
Yes.
That I think there's the heading for our thumbnail, Olivia, for this piece that goes out, because that's horrific.
And I'd believe it because just in my anecdotal evidence, I would believe that. Yeah.
Last question. Are you still going backwards and forwards, or is this kind of blowing your cover, so to speak? Is it still something you're going to try and do again?
It's blown my cover now, but I'm happy that that the girl is safe, and that's been a real win. Just getting her out. I mean, it's just, I know there's hundreds left in there, but it's just helping one has been really, really rewarding to get her on a new track to life. She's going to study soon, and so that's fantastic. But in terms of going back there, probably not. It's probably just going to cause more trouble than it's worth in terms of visiting the people that I still know in there. I need to be very, very careful.
Yeah. Olivia Wensley. Yeah. Hey, look, thank you so much for joining us. It's a fascinating story. The idea of the helping one, I remember there's that, it's not an idiom, but the story that people sometimes talk about the guy walking down the beach, and the beach is covered in starfish. I don't know if you've heard this story before. Beach is covered in starfish, and he's walking with his friend, and he bends down and he picks up a starfish and he throws it into the water. And his friend goes, "Man, look, what are you doing? There's thousands of these starfish. You can't make a difference." And the dude picks up, bends down again, picks up one more, throws it in, and he goes, "Well, it made a difference for that one." And then moves on. So I think it's a similar sort of story, and it's pretty amazing what you've done.
And it's not just that; it's all the children that she would have been forced to have.
Yep, and so it's a generational thing.
Yeah, and that's what it really comes down to. You know, if you save one, but it's also you're saving 12 kids that would have been born into that, and so on. So it needs to come down. It needs to be broken up. It's just appalling that it's allowed to exist.
Hey, mate, thanks for joining us today. It's amazing.
Thank you.
Right. Cheers, Liv. Oh, there you go. So if you've been watching and you want to comment, you're more than welcome to share your thoughts around, the Gloriavale situation. I know the story at the moment is all about, tax and paying people, but, when Olivia let us know that personal experience there, we wanted to put that story out there as well. And to hear that heading again, New Zealand's biggest crime scene, it's pretty horrific. George, I'm bringing you back in just in case you're doing something wrong, that you're not going to be caught short with your shirt off and tweaking your nipples or something. G'day, mate. How are you? You got any thoughts about that conversation? I'm a bit taken aback.
Yeah, I guess, and I mentioned this before, that the interviews is the sort of failings by, for example, even just in terms of an employment and labour specific issue, the failings of the inspectorate, for example, over the years. And I mean, like, for example, it seems like once a year TVNZ or someone do these documentaries, right?
Yeah.
It's sort of almost a genre in New Zealand news
Check
making.
out our crazy kooky people from New Zealand who live down there. But when you hear a police officer describing it as New Zealand's biggest crime scene, it puts a different spin on it.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that it's great to see as Olivia said, the rulings from the employment court, and also there's the Leavers volunteer sort of network that is constantly working, especially when our state institutions are failing the people there. They're constantly working to get people out and integrated into society. So, yeah.
All right. Hey, I'm sure this conversation will go on because once, as I said to you, George, I don't know if I've said this publicly or not, whether it was a pre-conversation or post live streaming, that there was a news item last night talking about 3 government agencies were immediately getting into Gloriavale to have a look based on this one ruling. So I guess that's what you see, the flow-on effect. So the story's not going away today or tomorrow. So I'm sure we will follow this one further and end up seeing what's happening. But there is a perspective, Olivia. I believe Olivia's never shared that story before publicly. So there's a little bit of kind of fresh news for you about someone who has actually been inside the walls in the compound and helped people get out. We are going to move on now, though. We're moving on to our next conversation for today, and that is about the wealth tax. We've talked a few times about the wealth tax. The last time we talked about it, it was talking about it in a bit generically, because when talking about a wealth tax, you can't really talk about something Labor's going to do when they've never talked about a wealth tax. So we talked about what the Greens' plan was. However, we saw an article written by Lisa Marriott, who is a professor of taxation, the other day, talking about, perhaps the wealth tax is a good idea for New Zealand. We thought it would be great to have a chat with Lisa. Great to pick up on, what her thoughts are and what's going on around that. So I managed to catch up with her yesterday afternoon, pretty much about why New Zealand requires a wealth tax. Welcome to the show, Professor of Taxation, Professor Lisa Marriott from Wellington University, Victoria University. Lisa, thanks for joining us.
Oh, you're welcome, Pat. It's great to be here.
Yeah, thank you. A great background you've got going on there, looking over the hills of Wellington somewhere, up in Brooklyn or something from the looks of things.
Oh, well, actually, funnily enough, I used to live in Brooklyn. This is actually looking now more towards the Botanic Gardens, actually. So that's a wee bit closer to town. But yeah, Wellington's very, very green.
Yeah. Hey, thanks for joining us. Completely unrelated to the conversation around wealth tax. Being a professor of taxation, do you get all sorts of people hitting you up for advice on their taxes? Like, can you give me, what do I do with my GST? Does that actually happen to you?
Oh, well, actually, funny enough, it does a tiny bit. But yeah, I actually no longer have a practicing certificate. So in fact, I'm in a quite a good position where I actually do not give tax advice. So it's easily resolved.
I read your article, and we'll bring it up here as well for other people to see in the conversation, which is a spectacular write-up. I'm subscribed to it, and I hear from them when they send out their information. We've been talking about a wealth tax here on this show a handful of times in the last couple of months. Obviously, it became news again when some media were pressing the Prime Minister to guarantee she wouldn't do one for the next election, and she very clearly said, we haven't looked at it. I'm not going to answer this question because there's nothing I can say because we haven't looked at it. So that put it back into the headlines, and we started talking about it. One of the difficulties with talking about this conversation is it's a little bit theoretical because the Labor government don't have a policy on wealth tax, we can't actually speak to any great specifics. So what we've done is we've had a look at what the Greens were proposing, because they did have an idea. But I guess I wanted to just talk about it again, seeing as we just see there, your article says, even if next week's budget avoids the issue, it's time New Zealand seriously considered a wealth tax. Why is it time that New Zealand seriously considered a wealth tax?
Yeah. So tiny bit of tax theory first, if I may. I'll keep it
go for it.
level. So really there's three ways that we would normally tax. And one of these is income, and we tax that really well in New Zealand. So that's, individuals' wages and salaries. The second is in consumption. So this is our GST, our goods and services tax. And again, we do this really well in New Zealand. The third way we would normally tax is this idea of wealth. And we don't really tax that comprehensively in New Zealand. There are some types of activity where wealth is taxed, but it tends to be only if the particular transaction is included in the Income Tax Act. So most countries generally have a general sort of capital gains or other type of wealth tax, which means that those transactions are automatically taxable. We tend to take the opposite approach, which is unless they're specifically included, then they're not taxable. To the specifics as to why we should tax wealth, well, and this is my personal opinion. The article was actually that we're a democracy. We should have a discussion about it, and we should be allowed to express our views on it. So my view is that we probably do need a wealth tax. Reasons for that is because of inequality. We see in particular wealth inequality increasing in New Zealand, and Max Brashbrook has some really nice figures around that, where the wealthiest 10% of people own 70% of the wealth, and so on. And wealth accumulation does tend to be self-reinforcing. So you've got the returns to wealth, which tend to be larger than gains on income, for example, and you have the wealth which is accumulated in a relatively small part of society, and that just keeps getting bigger and bigger. It's not taxed as it moves through generations, so the inequality problem is unlikely to be addressed in the absence of a specific instrument to address it.
Could we give an example, even if it's using the Greens policy idea, of actually what a wealth tax would do? Because I think they had a threshold of $2 million, because part of me thinks, and your article states this, and I think it's right, that it would be a pretty unpopular tax to bring in. But part of me thinks if it is only impacting the top 10, 15%, that means for 85% of the country, it should be popular. So I'm interested as to why it's unpopular. But before we go there, we should probably just think, like, even if it's another country's example or an example of what a wealth tax would actually do in a practical application in society.
Yeah. It's a really good question, because when I've talked about wealth taxes, I've used that phrase to capture the various different types of taxes that we would probably use wealth tax for as more of an umbrella type of term. Right. So I've included in examples. It could be a land tax, it could be a capital gains tax, it could be a wealth tax like the Greens have proposed, it could be an estate inheritance type tax. All those sort of taxes are different types of wealth taxes. The Greens one is interesting, which is the idea that you would tax on a specific amount, so 2 million if that's what is proposed, and if you have a net wealth above that amount, then you would pay a small proportion of tax on anything above that amount. So how that would work is, say you've got a $4 million house and you've got a $2 million mortgage on that house, you'd have net wealth of 2 million, and then for everything above that 2 million you would pay, as I say, normally a really small amount, so perhaps 0.5% or something like that. The issue with that type of tax is it can be difficult to actually pay, because a lot of people have assets, but
Yeah.
they might not actually have the cash to pay
Sure.
the tax as it falls due. So, I mean, there are ways around that, deferring the tax until the asset is sold and so on. But that's why those types of wealth taxes tend to be a bit less popular in countries these days. So things like capital gains taxes, the tax event, so the actual tax is due when the asset is sold, and usually people would have the funds to pay the tax when the asset is sold, and there's the gain has actually been made. You also have a market transaction at that point, which is quite good to actually accurately measure what the gain is on that asset.
Yeah, because one of the ones, and I brought up the greens while I was talking to you there. It's a progressive tax, and I wonder if that kind of tax idea, I'll just read this out quickly for people, by introducing a new tax on individuals' net wealth over $1 million. This means those who have their own wealth worth more than $1 million, not including mortgages and other debt, will be asked to pay a small annual contribution to fund stronger social support for all New Zealanders. This would only apply to the wealthiest 6% of New Zealanders. It is the kind of tax, and correct me if I'm wrong, you are the person to correct me, that would also be repetitive, though. If you had those assets and you got taxed in this financial year, and if you still had exactly the same, you'd get taxed again in the next financial year. I don't know about the idea of taxing the same thing on multiple times. Like my PAYE goes out, my money goes into the bank, the tax is finished on that. If that stays in the bank, I get taxed on any interest I earn from that money in the bank, but I don't get taxed again on the money that's in the bank that I've already paid tax on. There does seem to be something quite strange about, let's say I've got assets worth $3 million, paying a tax on them, and then next year paying a tax on them again, and then paying a tax on them again, which is where I think the, paying the tax when you sell a house, capital gains seems to make more sense. Is that one of the problems with that kind of tax, paying multiple lots of tax on the same item or asset over and over again?
Well, yes and no, because those types of wealth taxes tend to be at a very low rate, so maybe 0.5% or something
Right.
like that. That's why it is an ongoing tax. But to your point, you're absolutely right. It is an ongoing tax every year to the extent, and actually, $1 million is probably, when we've see what's happened in the housing market, $1 million of wealth is actually not really probably a lot these days. I would have thought, they're saying 6%. I actually would have thought it would capture a lot more people than that. But part of the problem is we don't have particularly good data about the wealth that people hold. So it would be quite hard to actually say with any certainty exactly how many people would fall into a tax like that. But the idea is that actually what they're trying to get at is the tax does only fall on the people who have the greatest amount of wealth, which, like I say, in New Zealand is probably not at $1 million these days.
I've often talked about the capital gains tax. That one of the downfalls of a capital gains tax to me seems to be, for so long, like under Robert Muldoon, there was a good savings scheme and there was a good scheme for retirement, which was then basically cancelled. And then we didn't see any other savings scheme for retirement until KiwiSaver came in. So what a bunch of New Zealanders did went, I have to look after myself. I'm going to buy some extra properties and that's going to be my retirement. I've always kind of said, and it's a bit of a wacky idea, that I think there should be like a moratorium to the date KiwiSaver started. Houses purchased before then should be exempt of capital gains tax, because you've got those 70, 80, 90-year-olds now who might still be living off those because they had to look after themselves because the government didn't have it in there. But then maybe houses bought after that date when there was an alternative, which was KiwiSaver, maybe they could be applicable to a capital gains tax, just because it does seem a little bit on the nose to have all those elderly people today, well, all those, the numbers who are able to do this, who may have purchased properties to look after themselves in their retirement, now be taxed for that because the government wasn't looking after them well enough in the 80s and 90s. You know what I mean?
Yeah, and I think it's a fair point. What normally happens with taxes that would be quite a radical shift like this is they wouldn't be retrospective, because to your point, people have made decisions on the information they have at the time, and it really isn't fair then to effectively change that environment. So normally what would happen is the tax would come in from a future date. So, there might not be a lot of notice, but it would normally be at some point around about the announcement. So it would be unusual to be retrospective.
The idea of this going to the polls, this being an idea that we put to the people and they want to vote on it, from knowing a little bit about the inside workings of many political parties, they spend a lot of time researching and, feeling the pulse of the nation and seeing what they're thinking. I would think that their internal research must show them that this is unpopular, and that it must show them that this wouldn't be something that a lot of New Zealanders would support, because if it was, then they'd be in. So it's not a guarantee, but I wonder if, what is your opinion on, would New Zealanders support a wealth tax, or is the evidence that no one wants to do it evident that New Zealanders probably wouldn't be in favour of this?
Yeah, it's such a good question. In my view, I think if people genuinely understood what a wealth tax is and who would pay that wealth tax, I actually think most people would be in favour of it, especially when you looked at what would be the result of having a wealth tax. So if we had a wealth tax and it would collect more revenue, the outcome of that would be either other taxes could be reduced, or we could have more spending, and who wouldn't want more spending on the health system or education or whatever it is. So, there is a real trade-off here. It's not just that people pay more tax and nothing else changes. I think the really important thing with these discussions on wealth taxes is we need to have good, sophisticated debate, and we need to have good information which is publicly available. So people need to understand that these taxes are not targeted at their one and only asset, which is their private family home. That's never the intention, that these taxes capture that type of an asset. They really are genuinely intended to capture or the people to be paying tax on the greater wealth, which is not taxing every last cent that people have by way of assets. So I honestly think if people understood that, there could be a greater acceptance. But it's a hard message to get out, because there's a lot of misinformation, and also people will just hear that is more tax, and it might impact on me. And there are, of course, aspirations. People always aspire to be wealthy, and when I'm in that top 5%, then I won't want to pay tax on my wealth. So there's a little bit of that as well. But like I say, if we were to signal that the proportion of people who will pay this is the top 10%, but of course they wouldn't be happy about it. But the other 90% who would ultimately be better off, you'd wonder why they wouldn't.
You talked about wealth tax being sort of an umbrella term, not necessarily like the Greens are talking about being quite specific. And you've talked about there could be, this could happen several different ways. Do you have let's say that the government was able to get one or two of a version of a wealth tax through. What do you think would be a couple of the low-hanging fruit, the ones that might be easier to get through and most received well by the country?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I quite like the idea of land tax. The reason for that is it's quite simple. There are valuation methods already in place. It's hard to hide by way of, with other assets. They can sometimes be a little bit easier to avoid. So there's a certain simplicity that would sit alongside a land tax. And simple taxes are actually quite good taxes because they tend to be easier to collect, easier to comply with, and so on. The other thing with a land tax is that you can make exceptions quite easily if you want to. So in the article I wrote, the Māori land, for example, you might want to carve out that. You might want to make concessions for productive land, farming land, those types of things. So there may be specific policy changes that you might want to make, and that they're quite easy to do with a land tax. So from a simplicity perspective, I do quite like that. The capital gains tax, I guess, is a very similar, except it usually goes beyond, would go beyond land and catch things like people's other investments, so financial investments in the form of shares and that type of thing.
Yeah, all right. I remember interviewing Hone Harawira back in the day, and I think the Mana Party had an idea about a transactional tax, and he described it to me. And he basically said, I think it was 1% transactional tax. And he described it to me basically, and I said, so if I earned $1,000 a week, and let's say I drew all of that money out of the bank, my tax on that would be $10, and that would be the only tax, no more PAY. And he said yes. And his numbers worked out that because obviously companies, all those parties that are transacting a lot more and a lot higher figures, that overall it would be at least as much taken tax, if not more. Was he right? Is transactional tax a reality, or was that just something that minor parties sometimes say because they can get away with saying anything because they're never going to be held accountable?
It's a great question. So for a while, and look, it might have been around about 10 years ago, the financial transaction tax was talked about in Europe, and they actually got quite close to introducing it, but ultimately I think it just ended up in the way too hard pile. You've described it really well there. So the idea is you have a really, really small percentage on every financial transaction. So your share transactions, as you say, your bank accounts, all your FPOS transactions, all those types of things. I actually had an honours student crunch some numbers on this around about the time that it was talked about in New Zealand, and we really struggled to get anywhere near the numbers that it was proposed. I mean, even actually at quite a high rate, we were still like maybe about only around perhaps 10% of what the current tax take is. So we couldn't really see any way to make that viable.
All right, very good. Now, briefly and finally, you talked before about who doesn't want more income to put into our health system. I guess my response to that is often right-wing parties seem to want less tax in the coffers to put into things like the health system. I'm a very simple man, Lisa, and sometimes I think about the budget to our country being like the budget to my household. And, you know, sometimes I want a bit of money left over in the bank when my hot water cylinder blows up, or if I lose a job and have to look after myself for 6 months, or whatever the case may be. It seems that there is I guess what I want to ask you, maybe if you've got a thought on this, is why does and I'm saying the right in politics, so I don't want to point fingers at any one party, seem to try and convince us that less tax is better, when I'm not saying you're saying this, but your point of a little bit more tax for the health system would imply to me that a little bit more tax, a little bit more than we need, might be the way that we keep ourselves safe from, you know, a rainy day. Is there a philosophy around why the right is always about, you know, less tax is better, less tax is better?
Oh, I think it just comes down to the size of the state. So the right parties tend to want a smaller state. So smaller states, you know, less spending on health, less spending on education, less spending on, you know, in general. And of course, if you're spending less, then you don't need as much revenue, and therefore you can reduce taxes. So, I mean, in my very simple understanding of it, that's how I would see it. Whereas the left-leaning parties do tend to want some more investment in society, and we need to pay for that. So there is the tax system.
You put it so succinctly, but see, it just makes so much more sense to me. It's like, yeah, of course, if we want more investment in society, we need a little bit more tax. I always wonder when we get promised like $10 tax cuts a week, you know, that's $1 billion out of the tax coffers, and $1 billion in the tax coffers to me feels more important to the country than $10 a week to me personally. But then again, maybe I'm not unique in that thought.
Yeah, again, I think it comes down to your personal philosophy, doesn't it? You know, are you more individualistic, or are you more community focused?
Yeah, I think that's fair. Professor of Taxation, School of Accounting and Commercial Law, Professor Lisa Marriot. Lisa, thanks so much for joining us today. I very much appreciate your insights into the wealth tax and other taxi issues.
It's been a pleasure, Pat. Lovely to talk to you.
And that's us. That was recorded yesterday afternoon about the wealth tax, and a professor of taxation sort of saying, well, maybe New Zealand, we do need it. All right, Georgie Boy's shot off. He's got to get to a class, his lecturing, his tutorials at Otago University. Before we go, some comments that came in from Richard, specifically to do with the Gloriavale conversation we had earlier. These issues have known about for at least a decade. Our government's version of the churches looking the other way, or was it collusion? So thank you, Richard, for your thoughts there. And that's us done. Let me just say again, remember, if you're with us, from next week, we're going to do this at 10 p.m. at night. We're going to be running BHN starting at 10 p.m. at night and running for best part of an hour, whatever it ends up being. And because we're still in our sort of soft launch stage, we're just seeing what works for people and what you guys want to see, if anything. And so a very similar show, sort of issues of the day, sort of a news conversational show, but we will be doing it at 10 p.m. at night. So if you are someone who's been joining us regularly, hopefully you'll join us regularly next week from 10 p.m. at night. Other than that, Jeremy Elwood, comedian Jeremy Elwood, is with us tomorrow for tomorrow's show. We will be looking, I was just looking at a headline actually on Omicron in the Herald, talking about the numbers that are going up in Auckland. I'll show it to you if you like. Show it to you, shall I? Show it to you. Let me show it to you. That one there. So this is about today's 1 o'clock bulletin. The level of Omicron's renewed spread in Auckland is set to be revealed by health officials. So yes, maybe the conversation, if you weren't with us at the start of today's show, that we started by saying, and you know this if you've been watching this, what the hell is the government doing in these places like Southern, which is where I am, Southern DHB, where cases have never got below about 2 to 2.5 times what they should be for a safe society, and normally they're at 3 or more than 3 times what they should be. And I'll say it again, I said this the other day, if the whole country, what the number that's mentioned for being sort of life back to normal with masks is 5,000 cases a day, 1,000 people per million. That means wherever you are in the country, work out what your DHB is and do it as a proportion of 1 million, and that's how it should be. So here in the South, DHB, citizens in DHB are between 3 and 350,000 people. So we need between 3 and 350 cases a day to be in that place of being comfortable to remove masks and stuff. We've been getting between 700 and 1,000 constantly for the past month. And I'm actually doing the numbers. So tomorrow's show, we might delve into a bit further the details. So talking about the release that I shared earlier today, the memo leak, the email leak, which is people from within the Ministry of Education basically saying, what the hell are you doing, government? We need to be protecting kids in schools. And I'm sure you're much the same. I don't know, maybe you're not, but a good proportion, maybe the majority of people that I know who have caught COVID have got it through their kids at school. So if you had a situation that's a feeder for a virus, it makes sense to protect those in that feeder, to protect them from the rest of society. What I was going to say about the 3 times is, if the whole country was at 3 times the number of cases per day, so rather than that 5,000 yardstick, if the whole country was at 15,000 cases a day, there's no way anyone would be in orange. Yet where the government has let us down significantly, for those of us who are in areas where it's still elevated, is that in Southern DHB, we are 3 times the number. So if there was 15,000 cases a day, that's 3 times what it should be. We would all still be in red. But we are 3 times the number of cases it should be in the South, as are other parts, as is Canterbury as well, I think, more than 3 times the numbers. Yet the government has us all in orange. It's a mistake, and it's going to give rise. There are schools in Auckland who are currently going back to enforcing masks. Why? Because, of course, there's going to be spreads again, because I believe the government wanted to pull out too early, and they wanted to actually give people a holiday, public demand, rather than continuing to follow the science that they were following for such a very long time. Anywho, that'll be me for today. I know. It does. One of the reasons it drives me wild is I have a child at home today from an intermediate school that's not enforcing mask mandates with a bit of a scratchy throat. So I'm like, okay, so the principal of that school has offloaded responsibility to the ministry, yet the ministry is currently not following what the epidemiologists are saying. Epidemiologists, everyone that I've spoken to Susie Wiles, I've spoken to Michael Baker on a couple of occasions, Michael Plank. There are more than that I've spoken to about various parts of COVID. And every one of them that I've said, I'm just this thick piece of shit from the deep South who wants this to happen. Where am I wrong? And every single one of them have gone, yeah, no, we don't disagree with that. And I'm like, hang on, you're not supposed to agree with me. You're supposed to agree with what the government's doing. And they're like, no, we don't agree. So I believe very, very strongly that the government has bowed to public opinion before Easter, opened up parts of the country. Now, Auckland might have been fine, okay? But other parts of the country, they put into orange too soon. And I believe they did it for a populist decision rather than a decision based around good health. And that, to be honest, fucks me off a lot. my kids are responsible. My kids are continuing to wear masks at school, but they are being let down by the systems around them, i.e. their schools, by not getting other kids to wear masks. They are being let down because my 12-year-old, who's wearing a mask during the day other than when eating lunch, is being forced to eat lunch inside with all the other kids with their masks off. And now my 12-year-old's got a scratchy throat. So those of us, and I'm including my children in this, who have been responsible around this, are now being fucked over somewhat because of the systems being put in place because they can be under orange thanks to the government decision of getting out too early, in my humble opinion, in the deep south. Now, your region, like, for example, I think over in Hawke's Bay, you're well below the number you need to be. God bless you. Maybe you should be in green, not even in orange. But other places in the country should still be in red, in my humble opinion. And I think what you're going to see is a rise in numbers. And I don't think someone's just mentioned put us back into lockdown. Nick's mentioned that. I don't know whether that's tongue in cheek or not, Nick. I don't think we'll see another lockdown, but I think what you will see is areas going back into red, and the government will look more foolish for that than they would have if they had to keep places that were 3 times the number of safety in red, in my opinion. And it will harm them. So they've made a populist decision because they thought people wanted to go away for Easter, and it's going to turn around to fuck them, in my opinion. We shall see. We will talk more about this tomorrow because I'm going to bring you some numbers, and I'm actually going to try and get someone from the Ministry of Education to talk to us. They may not because it may be too political, but we'll see what happens with that. And as I said, comedian Jeremy Elwood will be joining us tomorrow as well. Thanks, guys. Good to be with you. Back again from midday. Remember, next week we're going to be doing this at 10 p.m. at night just to try something a bit different. And yeah, be safe. Wear a mask. Get vaccinated. I'm thinking, is it Seth Meyer? I don't know if you watch Seth Meyer on the internet. That's how he finishes every item on the internet. Be safe, wear a mask, wash your hands. We love you. I won't go that far. I don't know. I like you. You're okay. We're getting to know each other a bit better. I like you. We won't go to the next stage just yet. Not you and me. All right, team. See you tomorrow from midday. Hooroo.